The shafts of bright sunlight on the walls of the room, yellow and strong, held Septimus's gaze as he drifted into wakefulness. Usually he was straight out of bed, no lounging about for him, but today something felt different. What was it? A feeling, in the pit of his stomach? No, not a feeling. The opposite. An emptiness. Like something was missing, something absent. Septimus turned his head towards the window, the breeze tousling the curtains and, shuffling up his bed, he peeped under the hem before looking towards the owl cage. No, it wasn't Mervine, who had clearly had his fill of rodents that evening and had littered the windowsill with pellets. The little feathered ball was perched in his cage, his head fixed forward, his eyes closed. Septimus shuffled back down under his covers and focused on the sunlight again. Was it Sam who had caused this feeling, with his exam results, his general certificates of magical education, mere days away? Decisions about his friend's future hanging in the balance? Septimus thought. And then he remembered the strange feeling inside. His mum was back. Of course. And Uncle K had said his dad was getting better, he was going to Hedgewoods, so too was his friend of course. The feeling was relief accompanied by a large dose of happiness about things being right. He thought briefly to the letter he'd had from Sam. How much happier he'd be when he next saw his friend, telling him he'd be going to Hedgewoods too. He glanced over at the letter, which was on the floor by his yesterday clothes. Septimus could understand how Sam would think it strange for non-wizards to be attending the school, and his friend had gone on to talk about next year being the first year of dual classification which would run parallel with the non-wizard education system. This was nothing new to Septimus, Callias had spoken to him about it when they'd discussed school. But Uncle K had gone further and suggested that eventually the wizard system would eventually be replaced altogether. And there'll be the new subjects, Sam had written, Mum and Dad have been working on what they might contain. Magically relevant science. Scientifically relevant magic, magic in non-wizard society, science in magical society. I wish we'd had some of these subjects when I was your age, September. He'd gone on to say, but what will be left out? I hope it's history of magic rather than defense. And then Sam had told him of his dream to become an in the European ministry, a demanding career which involved fight law-breaking wizards. Sometimes I wonder if I've passed anything at all. If not, I can forget about being in a. Septimus shook his head at the letter. If Sam Potter hadn't passed his OWLS, then there was no hope for anyone else. Sam had been encouraged to use magic at an early age, unlike Septimus. Dad had shown him a little, but Mum had said he should wait until he got to whichever school he would go to. Mum had encouraged non-wizard skills too, saying that whether he chose a wizard or non-wizard school, knowing how things worked without magic would always be to his benefit. Mum's right, thought Septimus as he pulled back the duvet, swinging his legs over the edge and getting to his feet. I wouldn't have attempted a lot of things by now if I'd have waited to learn magic. Not that he hadn't tried magic though, but it had always come out as a little blue smoky puff from his junior wand from the children's magic set that Cleus had given him on his 8th birthday. Wait until you're trained properly, Dad had said when, just after his mother had left, he'd tried to use a charm from the magic sets book and set the living room curtains on fire, and he was convinced his mum would be angry. Wait till you have a real wand. It'll be easier then. And then they turned up the curtains, Dad telling him that Mum would never notice and, even if she did, she wouldn't mind. Septimus knew his dad was right too. He pulled open his bedroom door, stepping carefully over the objects strewn in his path, and turned left, heading towards the bathroom. It wouldn't be long until he had his results anyway, and Septimus could tell him that he was going to Hedgewoods too. Ablutions over, and Septimus dressed himself in jeans and jumper. Although the weather was warm and sunny, he and Julian were going out exploring again. He approached the cage where Mervyn was sleeping, reached in his hand, moved it back quickly to avoid the startled beck from the unexpected fuss, then massaged the little bird behind his head. Mervyn opened one eye, made a quiet buzzing sound, almost like a cat purring, then closed it again. "If I leave the window open, you'll be fine, I expect," said Septimus to his owl, thinking about his mum's question the previous evening asking whether he was pleased him. "Mervyn is cute," Septimus had said. "I think he'll grow into a handsome bird. But I wish you'd been there to buy him, Mum, and Dad too." Much as he was growing attached to the owl, and was very grateful that Cleus had bought him, now that his mum was back it didn't seem quite right. "But you might not have got Mervyn," Cecilia had reminded him. "I'll be there at least to get your wand." Septimus smiled as he remembered his mum's words. She was happy with his decision, he could tell. No held-back words or changes of subject. Mum was pleased he was going to Hedgewards, and this had made him very happy indeed. Smiling again at Mervyn, Septimus turned and crossed back to the door, thinking about the mess and that he'd tidy up when he got back, grabbed his makeshift tea strainer net and fishing rod and headed downstairs. Mum was outside, having washed by hand what was in the laundry room, and she was hanging out towels, sheets and some of Septimus's clothes on the wide washing line, securing it with wooden pegs. "Have you had some breakfast?" she asked, turning from the washing and stepping closer to him, before pulling him in and kissing the top of his head. Septimus shook it, partially to shake her off and partially as an indication that he hadn't eaten. However pleased he was that his mother was back, he really hoped Julian was waiting for him on the other side of the hill and hadn't seen her making a fuss of him. "I've got some sandwiches, and Julian said we could go to his for lunch. What about some water? I noticed some bottles under the sink." Septimus tapped his bag, which also contained maggots, some cloths, rope, string and a small knife. "Got one, thanks Mum," Septimus replied. His mother's face fell a little at the missed opportunity to mother him. "And who is it you're meeting?" "Julian. Julian Scott. He goes to my school here," he added. "He's in my class. He lives the other side of Helvellyn. I told you about him yesterday." Cecilia's face changed from worried concern to a more relaxed expression. Of course you did. And is your Uncle K's spell still working?" Cleus had set up a spell so Septimus or Julian could reach him should they ever get into difficulty. "I think so," said Septimus. "I've never had to test it. Though there's been one or two close calls," he added to himself. "This is the Julian you said you'd gone to the Natural History Museum with?" Septimus nodded. "Because there's no fossils up here, of course, in this granite. He went at the start of the holiday to Lyme Regis. Fossil mad, he is." Not mad really, Septimus thought. His friend had a different way of looking at things. When he walked around he saw not the pavement but tarmac which had once been liquid and was now solid, different minerals making different rocks, gravestones, buildings, how rain, cold, thaw, frost, plants broke up the rocks, wore it away. "It can't be created from nothing," Julian would say, "and it can't be got rid of. Just changed." Julian's dad was also mad keen on geology and worked. He had a sister, Opal, and had his mum not been into Scottish poetry Julian Walter Scott would have been Jasper or Ein Scott instead. As well as being into fossils, Septimus's friend loved exploring nature, as he did, was a joker and far more outgoing and confident than him. In turn Julian loved knowing about the wizard world. His mum's family had some wizardly and witchy connection, and he knew in part this was connected with Julian and his family's decision to go to Hedgewards. "You have a lovely day then," said his mum, turning back towards the washing. Septimus made to turn but then stopped and he looked at his mother. Cecilia sensed that he was there and smiled, her brow furrowing. "What's the matter, love?" Septimus exhaled, not daring to wonder whether she would be there when he came back, as the nagging thought in the back of his mind had just struck him to consider. "I'm so glad you're back," he said, smiling. Cecilia went over to him and hugged him close, stroking his hair and kissing him as Septimus buried his head into his mother. He didn't feel ashamed to show his affection now, he just felt his love, and hers. "So am I, love, so am I now. Run along. Is that Julian waiting for you up on the ton?" It was. Septimus knew his friend would rib him shamelessly all day. Even now he could see a wicked smirk on Julian Waldescott's face. Before turning to go though, Septimus looked back to his mum. "Tonight?" "Yes?" Septimus hesitated. Then pushed forward on the path his mind had already carved out. He breathed out and swallowed, holding on to all his courage. "Can we go to see Dad?" He was relieved when he saw Cecilia smile. She bent closer and kissed Septimus on the cheek, stroking the other one tenderly. "Yes, my love," she nodded. "After tea. We'll go and see him together." 888,888,888. Cecilia had expected Septimus to want to stay up later than his bedtime that evening. It had been a successful afternoon and evening, if successful was the word. Septimus had arrived back at about 4, eaten the freshly cooked summer vegetables, local steak and roasted potato dinner she had lovingly cooked, and had walked to Ambleside to buy that morning, and had laughed when she had given him a strawberry mini milk lolly for pudding which she had had to keep cool in a cold bucket of water under the sink. The cottage had no refrigerator. He'd chatted about the day, how Julian had tried to cast his rod from halfway up a tree and, when it got tangled, as Septimus had warned him it would, had spent an hour untangling it before Septimus had used a basic spell to help him. "It's why he likes magic so much. He thinks it's cool, Mum," Septimus had laughed. Cecilia had agreed with him, casting out the negative thoughts which lined up to refute her son's friend's opinion on the matter. Callias had arrived back, as predicted. Cecilia had sent a flu message to him asking for him to take them both to St. Mungo's, and they'd spent an hour with Remus. Surprisingly, Septimus hadn't been as quiet and wary as she'd expected him to be, but then she'd realized that, unlike herself, their son had had almost a month to get used to Remus's condition. "He's much better than at the start," Septimus had told her as they'd left, on their way to meet Callias. "He was covered in more tubes, he'd even got a spell around him. It preserved him, or something. Uncle K said he was getting better, all he needs to do is wake up and he'll be fine." Cecilia had looked at Callias, who had approached them as Septimus spoke, and she eyed her brother-in-law suspiciously. Better? Who was Callias kidding? Was he just spinning Septimus a line to make him feel better, or did he really believe it? There was no point in asking when she knew she'd just get the diplomatic answer. As well as organizing the washing and food, Cecilia had spent the day thinking about the future. Now, so late into the night it was becoming morning, her mind would not let her get on with the business of sleep, mainly because there was someone she needed to talk to whom she could not get hold, despite her efforts. She'd go back to Dalton Drive, her, Remus and Septimus's home in Edgeford, of course. Stay at the cottage, if Cleus didn't mind. She knew he'd probably want Septimus to stay till the end of the holidays, and there was no point in moving him back for the week or so before he went to school. Besides, Callias had provided her with enough clothing, so perhaps he didn't expect her to leave just yet. Or had intended that. Cecilia never knew what Cleus's intentions were. Once Septimus had gone to Hedgewood's, she could start a new job. The credentials that the ministry had provided for her would work in the non-wizard world, Cecilia knew. Dave Mullen, another security minister, one far more frank than Callias, had explained when he'd furnished her with a passport, driving license and national insurance number, a job in no way connected to the wizard world, something that would continue to pay the mortgage which was being met by the ministry, under the hand of Callias. something too entirely unrelated to science, magic, teaching, research. What that left her Cecilia wasn't clear. Librarian? Bar work? Secretarial work? At least she would have time to visit Remus, care for him when he was released from hospital, and even if he didn't come straight back, have Septimus back home at Christmas, Easter, summer. Be a proper family again. In the wooden framed chair opposite the fireplace, Cecilia sipped her strong tea and smiled as she pictured Septimus's face when he had begun to tell her about his impromptu visit to Hedgewoods just before she'd seen him, when Severus had brought him back, and his excitement at the prospect of his new school. Despite her wishes for her son, for him to choose a non-wizard school, to stand apart from wizards, Cecilia knew that, deep down, she probably wouldn't be able to keep him from going. As Lily Potter had so acidly put it one evening, when she'd spoken her thoughts about Septimus's education, never again. If she were so against wizard schools, why had she married a wizard at all? At least he was going with his friend. Septimus would get a whole different experience at Hedgewoods now that non-wizards were to be accommodated. Her main reason for him attending a non-wizard school was to make sure he never held the prejudices so many other wizards did. Callias's policy, which she had heard Aberforth speak about before the reciprocators one evening, may well be the best thing she'd ever heard. Wizards couldn't help but begin to understand non-wizards, and they would grow and learn together. Not that she ever wanted to set foot in the place ever again. Cecilia rubbed her eyes, bringing her knees in closer as she shivered in the cool evening air. One more time she would try, and, if she couldn't get hold of Severus, she'd go to bed and contemplate how she would broach the subject of her immediate future with him. Approaching the hearth she knelt, withdrawing the small box within which contained the non-wizard flu powder, as developed by Remus's grandfather for their non-wizard grandmother. She had not brought it with her from the other place, but one of the first things she'd done when she had first come to the cottage, on her honeymoon with Remus, had been to explore the basement in the hope that she would come across the powder. She had been fortunate to find it, and, as it was so valuable, even Severus Snape said he knew of no way for non-wizards to communicate using the flu network, and, once she'd shown him, he said he knew of only one way. It was valuable and, as such, she'd used it sparingly. But, of course, with the pensieve network, any non-wizard with the technology could use it to communicate with any non-wizard, if they had a pensieve too and the correct pensieve code. Each device had its own unique code, like a serial number, making the flu network stays, if not numbered, far less busy than they might have been. The latest models of these pensieves, which, far from being the stone font-like structures she remembered Albus Dumbledore using in Hogwarts, were made in a wide range of materials and available in a myriad of colors she had seen in the window of what had been the hardware shop where, in the other place, she had bought the silver nitrate which she had used to develop the lycanthropy potion, which she had failed to do there and was not necessary to continue with here, as Snape had already done it for Cleus Lupin. For it was Remus's elder brother who had been bitten when Fenrir Greyback had broken into the Lupin cottage because of his supposed debt, rather than because of his loyalty to the reciprocators and his defense of the book Mysterious Mythology. Unique, for it had the code from which Cecilia had used to make the universal link between wizards and muggles. Non-wizards, she corrected herself as she stood before the fire, flu powder in hand. She had no other means of contacting Snape, and she knew that Cleus would know that they had spoken because of the itemized conversations that the flu network sent through. One last time. If he's not there, I won't waste any more. As the flames turned green, Cecilia stuck her head in fire, and through, could see Snape's office, that of Aberforth Dumbledore, and the memories of her last visit there, just before Aberforth had died, vowing she would do what she could for the reciprocators, bombarded her mind. And hadn't Cleus just called her on that one, effectively banishing her for over 2 years for the sake of the reciprocators and the ministry? She remembered the old wizard half closing his eyes as Cecilia had spoken her promise. For if you don't, Cecilia remembered Aberforth, who looked so like his brother, saying to her, "The alternative does not bear thinking about." Cecilia remained in the flames for a good few minutes, hoping that Severus would be around. When she realized that he wasn't, she was about to withdraw her head, the questions in her head receding. Just then the door opened however, and Cecilia watched as the headmaster of Hedgewood's School of Witchcraft and Wizardry swept into the room. Cecilia watched as Severus Snape took one look in her direction, continued across the room and then turned back. "Cecilia, you were not the person I was expecting to speak to tonight." "Severus," Cecilia replied, wondering what to say next. "I'm at Cleus's cottage." The information was needless, unnecessary. A lame response. "I haven't been avoiding you," Snape continued, his body still, staring down at her, "just immensely busy following my promotion and reciprocator responsibilities." How he did that Cecilia had wondered for these last dozen years. It did make for more direct and to-the-point conversations, but always made her feel her contributions were tame in comparison to his lofty work, and she hated speaking to him just after she'd spoken to Cleus. Her defenses were invariably high and suspicions wove in her mind, and if there was one thing to be said about Severus Snape it was that he was nothing like Cleus Lupin. In fact, he was hardly recognizable as the Snape she knew before either, and, while it had made their working relationship at Hedgewood's easier in some respects, a clean slate in a manner of speaking, it had taken Cecilia some time to get used to him. Yes, he was closed and shared nothing intimate, like Severus Snape of the other world, but their dealings were always to do with business, except, of course, where his beloved Tabitha Penwright was involved, whom Severus clearly adored above all others and had, on occasions, asked Cecilia's advice regarding suitable Christmas and birthday presents for her. One memorable time he had sought her opinion on what looked like seaweed but pulsed and glowed. It turned out it was a kind of organic communication medium which Snape had explained she would enjoy unraveling. Cecilia had agreed, though she was not sure she would have liked to receive it gift-wrapped on Christmas morning. "I wanted to thank you for bringing Septimus back to the cottage safely yesterday," Cecilia continued, on safer ground. She had been grateful, but she knew she was kidding no one that this was the reason she was contacting Snape by flu. "All the time I was away I worried for him," she continued, "that he was safe, that someone was looking after him properly. Remus, of course, and you. And Cleus. I'm grateful, I have to admit, that he's taken such good care of him." "Indeed," replied Snape, motionlessly, growling the word. There was no love lost between him and Cleus, though Cecilia had never discovered why. "And now you're back, to be his mother again. I believe he was as concerned about you." But one thing to say for him there was, when pressed, Severus Snape was brutally honest. She could always depend on Cleus Lupin to be hazy when it came to honesty. "I don't care what Cleus says about it all, what he might have already said, what he might have already done. I've given up my goose chase. Harry's potion. I was going mad, looking for something that was so obscure and irrelevant. She broke off, looking at the hearth. The unburned logs on the chimney's floor looked bizarre, unconsumed in the green flames. Cecilia looked back up, grasping to threads of composure and holding on hard. "I think I had a breakdown, if I'm honest. And I was probably crazy doing all I did to get here, but I had to. I burned all I'd researched for Cleus. I hope you did the same with my letters." "As I said," intoned Snape, "I've been busy, incredibly so. I do still have your letters but have yet to get round to dealing with them. If you wish, I will dispose of them." "I wish," replied Cecilia. "I just wish has never asked you. The connotations. I wish could have told you it was entirely to do with commonality. If Cleus finds out he'll lock me in Azkaban, for sure." She gulped, trying to hold back the tears. "I got rid of everything I had worked on for a reason. That reason was that I want my family back. No science, no magic." The base is what you had theorized, from what I remember, Snape replied as Cecilia's words trailed to nothing. You had never made it. You haven't the skill. There was silence. Cecilia knew what he meant. He would uphold her wishes, she knew, and was suggesting that, because she was a non-wizard, she couldn't possibly have made Harry's potions base, for the Harry in the old world, when the original potion had not worked properly. If only he was right. But Cecilia had acquired some magic when at Durmstrang. Somehow, though it faded as quickly as it had come and had never come back, despite her experimental attempts as she crossed the north of England. If Cleus ever did suspect she'd been involved in such things, he'd waste no time in putting her out of the way permanently, something Cecilia believed that her brother-in-law had solely wanted to do the last time she had given him good reason to. I am sure whatever you achieved at the Durmstrang Institute was worthwhile, continued Snape. You have skill, talent, understanding. Cecilia didn't say anything straight away. She had always felt that her voice always out of step since she had arrived in this new time. All that she had pioneered, been the first to discover and explore in the old world, had been done, built on, refined, and was a mere footnote in the textbooks. It was a world away from her discovery, a bit like Newton lecturing to the 1960s NASA space program on his newly theorized laws of motion with enthusiasm and keenness, as if addressing a virgin audience. Said audience had been polite and excused her idiosyncrasies, up to a point, but her contribution has been archaic, interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. I've put it behind me, Severus. I must, and I will. Remus, Septimus and I are a family, and I intend to do what I can to keep our family together. No matter what he's been thorough, or what will happen in the future, I'll be there for him. This is why I come to you now. I'll pay you, of course. I have no wizarding links. I'd have to ask you to wait until I found a job before I could pay you for your time, your expenses, your skill. Remus was bitten by a vampire over a month ago, Snape replied slowly. What makes you think I can do anything to help that the healers and the expert they have brought in cannot? Because you are you, Severus Snape. Cecilia shouted at him silently. Instead she said, I asked the healer what he was being given. The active ingredient, the ilium sativum, garlic, the sulfates within, I expect of a vasodilating effect, to widen the arteries. It's allowing the toxin to remain in his body but not coagulating and building up, not making clots which would overcome his immune system. I understand how that works, but it's too close for me to pursue. How anything can be done to rid his body of it, or prevent clotting when he wakes. I know it's not much to go on. It's all in the blood, thought Cecilia, dully. It always is, with wizards. The theory is sparse and sporadic, though I am working on Remus Lupin's cure, replied Snape simply. I will bear your view on the matter in mind. Please be assured that I will do what I can. Cecilia felt her pulse quicken. He was already working on it? No matter Snape's nonplussed response that he would do what he could, Cecilia already felt a glimmer of help where before there was none. If I write to you with my thoughts on the matter, will you read it? I always read what you write to me. You don't always reply. There's not always a reply needed, Cecilia. And, for the record, I am glad to see you back. Apart from Septimus, I bet you're the only one, replied Cecilia, but to herself. I just want my family back, Cecilia concluded, even Freya, if she wants to see me. As far as I can ascertain, she's still a spoiled brat, growled Snape, folding his arm. Well, she did break into your school, Cecilia replied, trying to suppress a giggle. Now, from this point of view, with over 2 years since the incident spanning the gulf, the episode did seem comical, especially with the imminent acceptance of non-wizards to Hedgewards in just over a week's time. If only Freya had waited a few years, she could have gone there legitimately. Speaking of family, continued Cecilia, her optimism pervading the conversation, how is Tabitha? "She is investigating," replied Snape. "So I have no real idea. She's never been in mortal danger when she has been with her artifacts." "Well, not often, anyway." Cecilia smiled again, and thoughts of Severus and Tabitha's wedding came to the fore of her mind. Interrupted by ministry, Vincenta had got something. Her work was like that, and Tabitha kissed Snape then disappeared. In the end they'd never married at all. The guests waited, expecting the service to continue. When Tabitha didn't return, the wizards and witches, some reciprocators, and Cecilia enjoyed the reception anyway, at Snape's request. Looking back, it was predictable. The wizards and witches knew her and accommodated her. Cecilia liked Tabitha too, not least for the fact she wasn't cliquey, she wasn't a plastic. "Perhaps I shouldn't have asked. I know I'm married to a wizard, but I don't want to get involved anymore. I want nothing more to do with it. I just need to avoid it all. That's my best chance of Cleus just leaving me alone." There. She'd said it. Said it to someone, and someone whom she knew would not repeat her fears to the wizard in question. Just when I thought the paranoid Cecilia Lupin had gone. Cecilia watched as she saw a smile play on Snape's lips. It wasn't a sneer, but it did contain a moderate amount of ribbing. Yes, she knew she was paranoid, but how could she not be? Her life here had begun 12 years ago. The one person who really knew all about this, whose political machinations could be affected by her actions. Her only choice was to forget it all and give Cleus no reason to let her be. Cecilia swallowed, and changed the subject. "I think it's a brilliant thing that you're accepting non-wizards to Hedgewood's." "Indeed. The Daily Prophet's saying that only bad things can happen with Hedgewood's. The letters page is divided by both praise and condemnation, and the ministry has made it worse by issuing a statement declaring their stance of integration benefits all." "I can understand why you're so busy," she chuckled. "Come to work back at Hedgewood's, Cecilia." It wasn't exactly a question. She fought with her mind for an appropriate reply. "You understand that if it were my decision alone, that is what I would ask you," Severus continued. "However, the ministry has such a hand in how the school is run, especially regarding the non-wizard admissions, of course." "I understand," Cecilia replied. She knew what he meant. He would have her, but he knew she wouldn't accept, and Cleus would be furious. "And I'm sorry to have interrupted you tonight," she continued, "especially as you've got Remus's situation in hand." "Thank you. And for looking after Septimus. I know how Hedgewood's can be, especially for the unprepared. I know you never wished for him to attend. And look, despite my intentions, he's going anyway. All decided without me. Goodbye, Cecilia." The fire dimmed, then the glow disappeared as Cecilia knelt out of the hearth. Cleus would know she'd contacted Snape, but not for the reason, unless he asked either of them. And what else could either Severus or Cecilia say? Then they talked about Remus. Yawning deeply, Cecilia made her way across the living room and up the stairs. The relief of knowing someone whom she trusted so much would have a hand in helping her husband being the ultimate sedative. Snape watched as the flame dimmed before casting a spell to erase the evidence of a non-wizard powder being used on the Flu network. If she was paranoid about Cleus, then he'd be rubbing his hands with glee at the thought of catching Cecilia with that. He would, eventually, tell her of this. And she was right, it wouldn't just be her who suffered. Snape could see every thread of Cecilia's life hanging there, ready to read her intentions, understand her motives. It was predictable that she would want the quiet life here, in the end. But she was wrong, of course, on one very vital point. "No, Mrs. Lupin," said Severus Snape, staring fixedly at the place where Cecilia's head had been, "it's all decided very much with you.